All right, Bill, as we were talking about, this is a, excuse me, it's a project for the Senior Lawyers Division to just capture the history and memories of practitioners, members of the bar who have attained an emeritus status, such as yourself. Let me start off by asking you to just give us a little biographical summary of your, where you were born and how you came to New Mexico.
Okay. I was born in Frederick, Oklahoma in 1937. My dad worked for a Gulf Oil Company. He was a driller on a drilling rig that moved all over wherever the oil was being drilled for. And Gulf Oil Company had this drilling rig with 3 crews, and the crews all moved with the rig. So we were with this bunch of these families of other people, and we happened to be in Waukeeta, Oklahoma. I mean, not Waukeeta, that's where my mother was born, but Frederick, Oklahoma. When my brother and I were born, I'm an identical twin, and my brother lives in Santa Fe now. So we lived there a few months, and off we went some other place, Kansas, Oklahoma. We lived in Oklahoma, Missouri. My dad lived in Missouri. We didn't really live in Missouri. We lived in Kansas, Oklahoma. Then we got to Hobbs in about the last couple of years of World War II. We lived in Michigan during the early part of World War II. They were drilling for oil on the peninsula there of Michigan. So we started kindergarten in Michigan, then moved to Hobbs and started second grade in Hobbs, and grew up in Hobbs and went to Hobbs High School, graduated from Hobbs High School in 1955. And I was already intent on becoming a lawyer by that time. And so I came to the University of New Mexico on a tuition scholarship. Tuition was $100 a semester. So I got a big tuition scholarship, so did my brother, and we came to the University of New Mexico. And graduated from, as I said, I was intent on going to law school from the start. I'm not sure exactly why, except that I had a couple there were a couple of lawyers in Hobbs who were sort of important in my life in a way. One of our members of our church was Ted Johnson, and Ted had been a lawyer in Hobbs for many years, did a lot of office work. And then Mac Easley was a member of the bar there and very prominent. He came and talked to the high school a time or two, and so that was interesting in that. Plus we had around our kitchen table, we had lots of big discussions, and mainly political. Our dad was a real Democrat and a real FDR supporter, and so we had lots of discussions, and we all turned out to be the same thing, but we had a lot of discussions. And so when I came to the university, I had the idea that I would go to law school. None of the members of our family had ever gone to college, except my mother went 1 year to OU and then had to move back home to the farm. And so we didn't really know much about anything about going to college, but I still had that plan. So I went to the University of New Mexico, majored in government, which is now called political science, and I actually minored in French. And the only reason I minored in French was because I thought, well, if I can get through one semester, test out of one semester of Spanish, I had Spanish in high school in Hobbs, then that'll save me a semester of languages and I can get through faster. So I didn't make it. I flunked the test, so that made me mad, and I said, well, I'll take another language, which I did. And then I found, that was a real big mistake. And I had my counselor there, he was a government professor, so that's what he was interested in, and that's why I majored in government. And nobody else told me anything, but I should have majored in, if anything, it's really dumb to minor in French in the University of New Mexico. If you're going to minor in any language, you should have been Spanish, but I didn't. So then I did 3 years undergraduate school and started law school in 1959. Graduated in 1961. And by that time I had decided, I think all along I thought, well, as far as I was concerned, being a lawyer meant going to court. although I really didn't know what that meant because I'd never been in a court in my life. I worked for a law firm here as a kind of an intern during the last 2 years of law
And
school.
what was that from?
It was Sheehan and Duhigg. Pat Sheehan and John Duhigg, the two most different personalities. I don't know how they ever got together, but they seemed to get along all right, and I worked mainly for John Duhigg because he was doing the plaintiff's personal injury cases, and that got me interested in that. And so when I got out of law school, Leroy Hansen and I were classmates, and so we decided we were going to open our own office downtown in Albuquerque. I was just reading a letter last night that I had written to my brother and sister-in-law when they were back in Washington, D.C. My brother got out of engineering school at UNM and then just figured out he didn't like engineering, which I could have told him from the start. But he went to law school in Washington, D.C. and worked his way through law school. So I read a letter. For some reason, they had saved this letter my wife and I, Patty, had sent to George and Jim back in D.C. And in that letter were some recollections of some things I was doing. That we were opening a law office, Leroy and I. Leroy was going to do the office work, and I was going to do the trial work. That was our plan. Nobody, I think there'd been one other couple who had started their own law practice out of law school at UNM. And we met with them and got some information from them. I met Patty. We got married at the same month that I graduated from law school and took the bar in '61. And then I went to the Air National Guard basic training because that was during Vietnam and I was about to get drafted. So I went to Air Force National Guard and I was in the Air National Guard the same month that I took the bar exam in August of '61. And then I worked for the Attorney General for about a year, waiting for Leroy. He was clerking for Justice Moise. And we, after that, we got an office down on the 7th floor of the Bank of New Mexico building. And I was just reading, that's the reason why I thought of that letter. I was just reading that he and I decided, we first thought we'd move uptown. You know, that's when Windrock was just starting. And we thought, well, there's a lot of activity up there. But somebody, and I don't remember which law firm it was, had told us if we would start our own practice, he probably could refer enough business to us for us to pay the bills. And we thought being downtown would help us get referrals from other lawyers. So we did a lot of legal research for $12 an hour, and we thought that was a lot of money. Back when I was first practicing, I think that my monthly salary from the Attorney General was $300 a month. And I thought that was a lot of money. It was more money than the law firms were paying. And so my first check I got from the Attorney General, I got 3 $100 bills. And I came home, we were living in Albuquerque and commuting to Santa Fe. Brought those $300 bills around, I threw them around the house, said, look here, is the first money I've ever made as a lawyer. So that was pretty exciting. So we then, Leroy and I opened an office on the 7th floor of the Bank of New Mexico building. And we got referrals for legal research. We did a lot of legal research for Schaefer, Butt, and Bass. And Gil Schaefer, Paul Butt, and Clancy Bass. Clancy actually had been in law school a year behind me, but he had gone to work for Gil Schaefer and Paul Butt. So we scraped together. Our wives went back to teaching because they could make more money teaching than we were doing practicing law. And we started in '62. And turned out that we both liked doing court work. So we did just everything you could think of, you know. We had somebody that wanted to file a bank. I could never make any money doing bankruptcy work, but I worked down the hall from Smiley. I can't think of his first name now. He was one of the first bankruptcy lawyers in the state. Tom Smiley. He was an artist and a bankruptcy lawyer. And then right next door to him was Alan Tonkin, who represented the Bank of New Mexico, and that was the building we were in. So we used to have these big discussions over lunch with Alan Tonkin and Tom Smiley, Leroy and I, because Tom Smiley and Alan Tonkin believed completely the opposite. And Leroy and I politically were completely the opposite. And we had to finally decide we weren't going to talk about politics at lunch because it got a little violent between us. So I did that for a couple of years, and then Leroy went with Dick Civarola, and I went upstairs to the next floor and went as an associate in the firm of McRae, Usry, Mims, Ortega, and Kitts. It was Al McRae, who was a mineral lawyer, Usry, a business lawyer, Albert Usry, a business lawyer, Frank Mims, who had been in the Rohde firm. In fact, he had been a named partner at one time in the Rohde firm, but he was on his own, and he was in with us. Arturo Ortega, who he and I eventually became partners, and then Bill Kitts. So we did, as you probably know, Arturo Ortega was already a prominent plaintiff's lawyer in town, and so was Bill Kitts. So we went our own way and started practicing in the Bank of New Mexico building I think that we then stayed on the 8th floor and shared office space with Poole and Poole. That was Rufus Poole and Bob Poole.
Well, now when you say we, do you mean you and Mr. Ortega,
Right.
or you, Mr. Ortega, and Mr.
Well,
Kitts?
That's a good question. It was Art and I were in a law firm together. I was an associate of his, and Bill Kitts was by himself, and he practiced in the same suite of offices that we did for a number of years. And so we practiced there for a number of years, doing what we did for basically the rest of our professional life, doing representing people who were injured in one way or another, and we did that. In the Bank of New Mexico building, we moved up to the 12th floor, and then in the 70s, we moved over to the Lovelace building, 12th and T. Harris, and we eventually remodeled that, and it became a historic landmark, and we practiced there for about 30 years.
Well, I think there's a lot of younger lawyers, or even lawyers like myself, who didn't go that route, the plaintiff's route, because of the financial insecurity, at least at the get-go. What would you say is the secret to, or the way to make an economically stable living out of plaintiff's work?
A good line of credit.
There you go.
That's actually that's a good question, because after when we decided in probably in the maybe the early 2000s or so that we really didn't need a firm. We really needed to help each other with our cases, but we didn't need to have the same overhead. Each one of us took our own overhead. We split up the firm and continued to practice. And my wife came to help me take care of the books, and she looked at that and she said, "You mean this is how we've been practicing law all these years? Because your income goes up and down depending on your cases. So you've got to have some way to stabilize that." And at that time, at least, it may have been easier then than it is now to get a line of credit. I don't really know, but in order to smooth things out, you had to know a banker pretty well, and so that's what we did. And you hopefully won more cases than you lost, and you really had to have a lot of confidence in yourself to be able to do it, and some luck and be in the right place at the right time, and it was one of those situations where I never really wanted to work for anybody, and that was one of my ideas about what a lawyer did, and I had these thoughts, which I still have to this day, that you need to develop your own practice in order to be independent, and that's what we proceeded to do. And cases came. You never know where they came from, but other lawyers would refer cases, or other friends would refer cases. And for the first, when Leroy and I were practicing together, and even when Art and I were practicing together, there were quite a few months when it was a little touch and go. We had, at one point, we had this really complicated case against the lumber company. And we had a trial for fraud against this lumber case. The case lasted probably 2 years or so. We had a trial, which at that time was the longest case in the history of the state, 8 weeks in trial in Socorro. And it was very interesting the way things worked in those days, because even though you had opposition, you also had some feeling of professional courtesy. So in that case, we all had to stay in a little motel down in Socorro. Both sides were staying in the same motel. That motel caught fire, and we had to help the defendants. They had all their exhibits.
Oh my goodness.
And we had to help them rescue all their exhibits to use against us. The judge in that case ran out of jurors, and he had to just go out there. There was a rule, and I don't know whether this same rule applies, but he had to go out on the street and just bring people in. At that time, the judge could go out on the street and haul people in and qualify them for jury, and that's what he did in that case.
Who was the judge?
It was Judge Joe, he was a Court of Appeals judge, and Joe, what's his last name? Joe Wood. Joe Wood had been a lawyer in Farmington, and he had been one of the early Court of Appeals judges. And so he was designated because all the judges in that district had disqualified themselves. It was a pretty prominent case. The business was the lumber business. The lumber company was fairly politically connected, and so it was difficult to find a judge. So all the judges disqualified themselves, and Joe Wood was appointed by the Supreme Court to try the case. And so that case, we learned out a lot about Socorro in those days. We had one of our associates had been the DA there, and we had some friends there. So what would happen was, actually, Art had to come down in the middle of that trial and try another case because we needed the money to keep going. And he tried that case. Fortunately, he won it, got enough money to keep going, and so we continued with the case, and it was a very interesting case. Involved the doctrine of economic compulsion, which had never been used before in New Mexico. And in fact, that case, Terrell versus Duke City, established the doctrine of economic compulsion in the Court of Appeals.
What was the plaintiff's name? Trail?
Terrell, Bill Terrell. He had a sawmill, and he had made a deal with this Duke City Lumber Company, and Duke City Lumber Company had proceeded to basically squeeze him until they forced him into making decisions that were economically devastating to him, and that's the economic compulsion part of it. He had no choice. So that was one of the doctrines we used in that case, and we won the case in trial, and then we spent the next 2 summers. I spent the next 2 summers. I would go to my office during the day and work with my regular cases, and in the evening I would go to the law school and research this case because it was a huge transcript we had to work with, a 5,000-page transcript.
Yeah.
The court reporter, who, I've forgotten his name now, he no longer is around, but he did the face mask kind of court reporting.
Yes.
And he would all day long would talk into that mask, and he had a bus out by the side of the courthouse, and that night he'd have to transcribe it because the model firm was the defense lawyer, counsel in that case, and they wanted daily transcripts. So he would go and type the daily transcript and come back the next day and continue with these steno-masks, they call it, steno-mask technique. So he did that for 8 weeks, and I guess he might have made a fairly good amount of money, but I don't know how he survived doing that. And so.
Yeah, I had one deposition when I was very first practicing law, probably the same guy. He was by that time a pretty older guy, kind of heavy, and yeah, he did that talking into the horn kind of thing. It was pretty amazing, but I never saw it again.
You know, I actually learned how to do that because when I was in the Air Guard, I was a legal assistant. I wasn't an officer, but I was a legal secretary, I guess they called it. And I had to learn that steno-mask technique. I never used it, but that was one of the training things I had to go to.
Well, and I had heard the phrase "millions for defense, not a dime for tribute" applied to the Liebermans who owned Duke City Lumber.
Yeah,
I don't know if your case is the one out of which that came.
well, you know what? It probably was, and not only that, it worked because at the end, after all those, we won the case in the Court of Appeals. We had our exhibits included a 20-foot long log that we had cut into pieces because we were trying to demonstrate how the sawmill worked. And we had all kinds of exhibits like that, and we had to account for those exhibits. Joe Wood made us account for every single exhibit every day, and we had hundreds of exhibits, so it took us a long time to close down at the end of each day. Duke City spent a lot of money on that case in various and sundry ways, I think, and we won the case on appeal. We argued the case in the Court of Appeals. If you can believe this, they usually give you an hour. We argued the case for a day and a half.
Oh my gosh.
And we won that case. They wrote a long opinion affirming the verdict. And this is one of the big lessons I learned in life about patience, because you know the Supreme Court has a certain amount of time within which they can just accept, assert, or not accept, assert. And so the last day of that time, I called the clerk's office, the Supreme Court clerk's office, at about 4 o'clock. The court closed at 4:30, and said, "Well, did they accept this appeal?" And the court clerk said, "Just a minute, click." I said, I used a few words in my mind I won't say here, but she came back and said, "They just granted cert." And so they granted cert. They reversed the case without opinion, and that was the end of that case.
Wow.
So, I'm pretty sure that, you know, in those days the courts were a lot more political than they are now, and they were a lot more closely connected. Even though you have an election now, after the first election, the courts are not beholden to. But in those days, it was pretty. And the Liebermans were pretty closely connected. I've always thought that was what happened, but anyway. Another interesting thing about that was right after, within about a month after that case was reversed and dismissed, they didn't reverse it and for a retrial, they just dismissed the case without opinion. And about a month after that, I had to appear before the same judges who had reversed the case and present the rules of evidence to them, because I was on the evidence committee. Now, that was one of the hardest things I ever did, was look at those guys and say, well, okay, we're going to get through this. So anyway, that was a big experience.
What about your, while you're on that, can you think of one or more, a personal injury case that was particularly meaningful for you to win for the plaintiff?
Well, some of the ones that I remember the best didn't involve a lot of money. Let me tell you a couple of small ones, but the one that was really meaningful was not a personal injury case. It was a fraud case against a lawyer, it was a malpractice case against a lawyer, including fraud. And this lawyer was a notorious guy in town, and I won't name him, but we tried this case against him for fraud, and we won the case. Not only did we win the case, but the jury sent us out a bouquet of flowers and a note calling us white knights in shining armor for having sued that SOB. And so I sued him 2 more times, actually, and according to his lawyer, I got his last $10,000. Then he went into the real estate business. The disbarred lawyer did. So that was you know, just generally speaking, the economic, I mean, the emotional benefits you get out of representing people who are injured. You know, I could talk about specific cases, but really overall, the impression is you really get, at least I did, got a lot of feeling that was helping people. So my experience was that it was very very rewarding emotionally to do that kind of practice. The last case I did, actually, which was about 2.5 years ago before I retired, was with Stephen Dorkovich. We brought suit against one of these giant medical aggregations. You know, in Tennessee, there are a couple of big corporations that own lots of hospitals, mostly rural hospitals, and they own a number of rural hospitals in New Mexico and take a lot of money out of the state. And we had a case against one of the doctors in one of those groups owned by this company, and we got it was a non-jury case. We got a judgment against them, but we couldn't prove punitive damages, and so we didn't get punitive damages. Well, then Steve had another case against the same organization but another doctor, and he discovered that the big company, the one from Tennessee, had committed fraud in our case by failing to disclose how much they knew about this doctor's bad conduct. So that was a really interesting case. We tried that case we never tried it. We took depositions. We did this. The big company back in Tennessee tried to get us thrown in jail in Tennessee. They did all sorts of things, but we had a very courageous judge, actually down in Carlsbad, and she held her feet to the fire. And when we finally forced the CEO to have his deposition taken, they finally settled the case, and it was very, very satisfying because the guy who had been injured by it had lost his leg as a result of bad conduct by this terrible doctor who they'd hired knowing he was terrible. By that time, by the time we got through the second case, he had passed away because of some of the injuries, but his family was left destitute, and they became financially stable after that. So that was the last case I did, and one of the most interesting cases because the amount of money that those companies can put into those cases is pretty astounding. You know, another case that really comes to my mind was the case involving a guy who was injured in the molybdenum mines in a construction accident, and he was rendered quadriplegic and brain damaged, and we pursued that case, and we finally it was a Lloyd's of London case, and they threw everything at us they could think of, but we finally got that case, and we were able to get the money. If he had died before the case was over, then the whole case would have changed, and his family would have been a lot less provided for. But we got the case. We got the family. He had young children. He got them provided for. Got his wife provided for, and then right after that he died, and so they were well taken care of.
Well, there was a time, Bill, when you know, now that I'm a senior lawyer myself, I mean, Ortega and Snead was certainly the biggest, what was thought of as a plaintiff's firm, if not the only firm that you considered a firm that did plaintiff's work, and the best. That was just the common knowledge. Now, how has the practice of plaintiff's law changed since those days? And I'm referring to the 70s, 80s, early 90s.
Well, let's take a little bit at a time. Technically is a real good way to start that. Technically, things have changed tremendously because of communications ability, computers, that sort of thing. So you have access to a lot more information than you had before.
So is it fair to say it's a little harder to starve a plaintiff's lawyer out now?
Yeah, I think so. I think it probably is. And then the other part that I found to be very hard to deal with was the advertising, lawyer advertising.
Yes.
And the problem with that is, this is me speaking from probably an old-fashioned viewpoint. The problem with it is advertising lawyers get so many cases because advertising works. It's a very good way to get cases in. It does a couple of things. It lets you start faster as a lawyer. If you can get your advertising out and start, it doesn't make any difference how much you know. If you get the clients in, you can eventually learn how to do it, I guess. Actually, I had a really good example of that. I had a guy several years ago come to see me to be his coach. He'd just come to town from New Jersey, been an estate lawyer, and he wanted to get into personal injury work. So he wanted to hire me as a coach to coach him how to be a plaintiff's lawyer. And I said, well, you can't coach somebody how to be a plaintiff's lawyer. What you need to do is do some cases with a lawyer that knows what he's doing, and then work it. See, he didn't want to do that. 6 months later, he was advertising as a plaintiff's lawyer, handling only large cases because he had settled some case and gotten enough money to get his advertising out. So he didn't know anything at the time he started that. So the problem with advertising is it gives lawyers lawyers' clients a handicap because juries think all these cases come in to you because you advertise that you're just out for the money. So you have to deal with that in voir dire and make sure that juries understand what's going on. And secondly, if you take too many cases, you really can't process them that well. And that's my opinion. I couldn't have, at least. I never did advertise, but I was leaving the practice about the time the advertising got the biggest. So I thought there was two problems, and the Supreme Court ruling that that's commercial free speech, I thought was almost as bad as the one ruling that corporations are persons that are able to politically, monetarily contribute to politics as they are now, which completely upped the game in politics, made it very much more difficult for people to get into politics on a small level because of the amount of money involved, and the advertising is sort of the same way.
I remember, and I will check with him to see if we can leave this in the tape, but Chuck Reynolds, who used to practice with you and is a long-term friend of mine, at some point we had a conversation like this about the changing of plaintiffs' work and the way he described advertising as disadvantageous to the practice and to the plaintiff was, he said, it cheapens the value of the good cases because the big advertising lawyers tend to settle everything.
Yeah.
Is that something you'd agree with?
Well, I don't know whether they settle everything or not, but my experience with the few experiences I've had with advertising lawyers says that's true. And in fact, one of the lawyers who has advertised the most made the statement that some lawyers are good at trying cases, other lawyers are good at settling cases, and he was good at settling cases. So that tells you what something. And as far as cheapening the cases are concerned, it depends on who the lawyer is. I think lawyers make up their mind early on. I know lawyers who don't advertise. I know lawyers who do advertise, and they aren't necessarily one better than the other, but I know the lawyers who just take it slow and learn the ropes seem to me to be able to better do it when it counts.
Talk about, if you would, you adverted to it earlier, sort of the decline, if not the death, of civility between lawyers? Do you have any observations on that?
Well, it still depends. There are lawyers who are civil and lawyers who aren't civil, and there were the same kind of lawyers back then. But now it seems to me that the competition, and it's not necessarily plaintiff's lawyers, but the defense bar has competition to get payment from insurance company. Their real client is the insurance company, and they really have to make themselves look good to the insurance company. I remember a case, and this is a long time ago, but I still remember a case when we were trying a case up in Taos, and the lawyer on the other side was arguing a motion. The jury was out. He was arguing a motion, and he was talking really loud because he was hoping the jury could hear him through the door at the Taos courthouse. It was upstairs, and the jury was in the room right next to it. The judge said, "Mr. So-and-so, you don't need to speak so loud. There's no jury here." And he said, "Your Honor, my jury is back in Chicago, where the insurance company was." So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking works. It becomes less civil if you have to prove you're the toughest lawyer to the insurance company. Then that's where you get paid. And I suppose in advertising as a plaintiff's lawyer, you probably get clients thinking that. So.
Let me ask, I think our questionnaire here does ask us to, does direct us to a few questions. One of them is, how did your career evolve? And you covered that very well. This is a hard one because it puts you in the position of fluffing your own feathers, but can you think of what you consider to be your most significant contribution to the law?
Well, I think probably the most rewarding thing that I was involved with was the active status of the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association, because that got restarted back in the mid '60s, and there had to be some organization that put forth the victim's case, both in the legislature when they're talking about restricting cases like putting caps on malpractice or caps on this and caps on that or preventing you from going to court. You needed some organization that would stand up and be counted and would stand up and be vocal. And the Mexico Trial Lawyers Association became that voice for a long time and still is. And it was one of those situations where if you're on the board of the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association and you got a call from and your job was to handle some particular legislation in the legislature, for example, and they got a call that it was coming up for hearing, you just had to go no matter what. So that organization, I think, being involved in the rejuvenation of that organization was one of the things that I thought was probably one of the most effective things that I was involved with. And I've had a few cases where setting some legal precedents, like
tell me about any of those.
Well, here's a real interesting one. I represented a blind guy years ago who had bought a house that had a fireplace in it, and the advertisement was wood burning fireplace in the den. And so he got in there and brought it. He had a little girl, his little daughter, and he went in and they lit up the fireplace and they almost asphyxiated themselves because the fireplace was not operational. So we tried this case, and the judge said, "You can't prove that they didn't do something that he couldn't find, and just because he was blind, he didn't have any more rights than anybody else. So he loses." So I told him, "If you'll pay the cost of the transcript, I'll appeal that case for you," which we did, and we established the doctrine of what's called innocent misrepresentation. If you misrepresent something, then you're responsible for it. Whether you don't have to prove that you were negligent or that the realtor was negligent or whatever, it's just the representation was caused damage and you're responsible for it.
Was that a theory that was alive in other jurisdictions?
There were not very many cases, but yes, there were a few cases in other jurisdictions that had it. We had never considered that before in our Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court, I think, ruled on that case. And that was, I really enjoyed that. I'll tell you another lesson I learned. This is probably one of the funniest cases I ever did. Well, no, the funniest case was the Billy the Kid case, but I'll maybe tell you that in a minute if we have time. But my very first case was a case involving a lady. This was when Leroy and I were first starting practice, and this lady was a cat lover, and she had her house stacked up with cages of cats. And it was so bad the neighbors said they couldn't go outside when the wind was blowing the wrong direction because the odor was so bad. So the Humane Society made a raid on her. Her canary had a heart attack, and the cats got all confiscated, and so I defended her. And so I was going to defend this case. This was when I was practicing law about 6 months probably. And you know, the rule is never ask a question you don't know the answer to if you're cross-examining somebody. Well, I was going to really nail this Colonel Huey, who was the head of the Humane Society, the dog pound, whatever you call that. So I knew he'd been in the Canine Corps. So I got him on the stand, and I was going to prove he was a mean guy to deal with this poor little old lady the way he did and cause her canary to have a heart attack and losing all her cats and all this stuff. So I said, Colonel Huey, you were in the, oh, you know, the judge was Robbins, Mel Robbins' dad. He was a municipal judge and had a real good sense of humor, but he was the judge, and he knew I didn't have any experience, so I'm going along there, and I said, Colonel Huey, you were in the Canine Corps, weren't you, in the World War II? Yes, I was. And you taught dogs to be guard dogs, didn't you, sir? Yes, I did. And I said, in order to train dog, the Canine Corps has to teach them how to be psychopaths, really, because they have to be loyal to only one person. Am I right? Is that what they do? And he said, that's what they have to do that. That's right. I said, so when you were in the Canine Corps, you taught dogs to be psychopathic killers, didn't you? And he said, actually, I was a cook. So I learned that lesson about not answering.
I also have a question about the canary. Did you autopsy the canary, or did you just assume?
No, but you know, we appealed that case. Well, she got convicted, of course. We appealed that case, and the judge in the district court, Judge Tackett, who I'm sure you knew, said, okay, I'm going to let you off the hook here, but the only animal you can have is one dog. So she was left. She got the case dismissed, but she could only have one dog, and she swore. She was the really quietest lady you ever saw, and she swore to me that she was going to do everything she could to make her house inhospitable to all her neighbors who she thought had gotten her. And I won't tell you what she did, but it wasn't very good that she tried to do.
Well, let's finish up with the Billy the Kid story.
Oh, the Billy the Kid story. Okay. That was my, actually that was my next to favorite case, but my favorite case is a little longer. I won't go into that. But Billy the Kid, you remember here not too long ago, Billy the Kid got to be popular again, and so this lawyer from Texas was designated by the governor to be Billy the Kid's lawyer in that case because they wanted to prove who Billy the Kid was. There were two people who claimed they were Billy the Kid, one in Arizona and one in Texas. And then saying that Billy the Kid wasn't killed by Pat Garrett in Fort Sumner. So I got involved in the case because the medical examiner's office was having to defend themselves because they had the duty to sign off on any excavations or any body disinterments were concerned. And Billy the Kid's mother had been buried in Silver City, and so this lawyer from Texas wanted to dig her up. And they were talking about getting some DNA, and the only maternal DNA is the kind that you can trace ancestry. Well, there was a forensic anthropologist who had done a big study and taken a lot of positions in this case. So this guy was going to depose her, this guy from Texas. So we got we got walked into the room, and this guy, he was young, he's short, the guy, really slick back hair, and I was just going to tell him we weren't his enemy. You know, if the governor would sign a letter approving this digging him up, we'd do it, but the governor wouldn't do it. So I was going to talk to him and say we weren't his enemy, and he said, well, hold on, man, I got to answer this phone call. And so he came back and said, well, I tell you, he said, you know, you just can't not answer when the governor calls you. And so we went in for the deposition, and we were sitting there, and I was sitting like, he was across from me like you are. The court reporter was next to him, and the client was over here. So this guy, young guy, pulls out a big old empty Coke bottle, sits it on the table, reaches in his pocket, gets out a can of snuff, puts a big old wad of snuff in his upper lip, whereupon the court reporter sticks up a big barrier between her and him because she was ready to go to spit on her, and the deposition just went downhill from there. And so we had to. She really, the forensic pathologist said, you know, you couldn't tell whose bones were what in a place like that. They'd had several floods. They'd moved the bones here and there, and so then the case got dismissed by the judge shortly thereafter, and I thought, doggone, that would be the most fun case to try, but I never got to try it.
Oh,
so case
a
got
near
dismissed.
miss.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. We could go on forever, but
Yeah.
this is, you know, this is rich stuff. And I do want to close with this, you know, the questions you asked the sages. If you were talking to a graduating class of lawyers today, what can you think of the top 2 or 3 or 5 things you'd tell them?
Well, my viewpoint is that the best way to practice law is to be independent, whether you're in a firm or whether you're by yourself. And to be independent, you have to have your own clients, and that you should be active in the community. Oh, that's a really important thing. I've talked to some lawyers, young lawyers, who said, you know, why did I practice law for 53 years? Did the same sort of thing. I never got tired of it. And they would tell me, I've been practicing law for 5 years and I'm burned out. I said, what else do you do besides just practice law? Well, nothing. I just thought it was an easy way to make a living. I said, well, first of all, don't practice law for the money. That's not a good way to live your life, no matter what you're in. Secondly, find other things to keep your mind active. Do things for the community. Be active in the community. Not only does that probably result in you getting some clients, and maybe not, but it gives you a sense of purpose. So my advice is to be active in the community, to do the kind of law that satisfies you, and don't think about there's another part of it too. Don't think about how much money you're going to make when you're practicing law, because it's not worth it. And the last thing is, live where you want to live, and practice where you want to practice. You can't really pick. If you make a lot of money in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and you wish you'd lived in Taos, you're just doing yourself a disservice.
Well, what are some of the things that you did? I know you were active in party politics.
Yeah, I wasn't really all that active in party politics, but I was. I mean, I have been active in politics, but not really. What I did was
that brought you pleasure. That you enjoyed contributing.
I enjoy right now. What I'm doing is working with the Heading Home project the city has to keep former homeless people in their homes, and to work with the individual. I like to work with people, getting people who have been homeless to help them adjust to being in their homes. Right now, I'm helping a guy who's in the early stage of Alzheimer's and to live in his home. Then my wife and I are also working with down in the South Valley with a group that's in the Presbyterian Church down the South Valley, teaching recent immigrants how to speak English better. Not that my English is that great, but teach them how to speak more normally so they can progress, because they really can't get ahead unless. And these people are really motivated. We get such a kick out of that, talking to the people who are just working their way up, and they have a chance to do that, and they need to be given that chance, and they need to have people. We all need to help people like that. So we do that, and we do some church work. I used to work down in Chihuahua and in the Michoacan area with helping people learn how to farm better, so they could make their living themselves and not be dependent on other people. So if people get a chance, they ought to be given a chance to figure out how to and have the help to figure out how to live their. I think people can live their life if they're given a chance, but if they don't have, we have a huge homeless population of students in Albuquerque. And can you imagine being a student and not even having a home? Right. Those kind of things are things that we need to do a lot about, and we don't do enough. But the Heading Home project is a project that really has been helpful to us as far as helping other people is concerned.
That's great, Bill. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.